team on this talk. I'll give the first half of it, and then Brian Tangen, who's a co-researcher on this tile project, who's in Lincoln, Nebraska, is going to give the other portion of it. What you guys can see on the screen here is our cooperating agencies, of course, Northern Prairie Wildlife Research Center, but we're also working with the North and South Dakota Water Science Centers. They have been a tremendous help, especially with the field portion of the work. Our U.S. Fish and Wildlife partners is, of course, the Plains and Prairie Pothole LCC, the Chase Lake Prairie Project, in particular Neil Shook, who's the project manager out there. The Partners for Fish and Wildlife, I see Kurt's on the line. Habit and Population Evaluation Team, that's the Habit office in Bismarck. And the South Dakota Ecological Services Field Office. We're working with Matt Swartz, who's an environmental specialist down there, looking at pesticides and herbicides coming out of tile effluent. Am I coming across okay, guys?
Yes.
Okay, great. We're also working with the North Dakota Department of Health, Mike L's group. We're looking at water samples from our wetlands that are being tiled and not tiled on our project, looking at basic nutrients and basic chemistry on these wetlands, kind of monitoring how they change over time. And I am acting as the project coordinator. All right, so kind of the goals of our project, our title of our project at the top there, but the goals are to provide a spatial overview of tile distribution and regional assessment of the potential effects on wetland hydrology. And the other part is to assess in situ hydrological field data on tile wetlands that use the minimal impact practice. That is the setback designed by the NRCS. The approach we're taking is basically a two-prong approach. The first one is the spatial GIS component, where we try to gather information as characterizations about tile, where it is, what kind of tile, the infrastructure, and make projections on where it's going to go on the landscape, and try to model those effects. In fact, both prongs, number 1 and 2, both go into that modeling effect. The second prong on this thing is called the field component, which is designed to get information about the catchment water balance, the tile discharge, so we can kind of shed some light on tile effects on wetland hydrology. I'm going to talk about the field component first, and then quickly go back over to spatial component, and then turn it over to Brian. So for our field study, the objectives, in simple terms, was to assess the setback distance that's being used, monitor the water balance so we can get inputs for our model, and the tile discharge. All that kind of goes into the potential effects of tile on catchment hydrology. That's our basic question. The things we're measuring are direct measurements as water comes into the catchment, indirect flows into the catchment, and we're going to use a site comparison and a model to help predict how hydrology changes with tile into catchment versus without tile. So our field design is basically, like I said, a comparison. We have 2 catchments in one field, and it's called the Beck WPA. It's here in Stutsman County. Those are our tile sites. And then we have 2 more sites just about 3 miles as the bird flies away from that, called the Roosevelt WPA. These sites are really nice because they're in the same kind of topography. They're mapped as the same soils. The size of the wetlands are about the same. Their hydrology is close, although we're questioning a little bit of one of them. All right. So we're going to, like I said, we're going to model the direct inputs, and the direct inputs in this case are weather. We're looking at precipitation, radiation, wind, all the weather components. We're also looking at water level. We're going to measure the tile discharge. We're looking at soil moisture and temperature, and that all goes into our model, which Brian's going to talk about. Now the Beck WPA, we went out and did a topographic survey of it, so these lines kind of show you where the catchment boundaries are, and to define this catchment is that this is the upper slope, so if a water dropped on this catchment line and it it rolled downhill, it would land in the wetland. If it landed on the outside of the catchment line, it goes someplace else. So that's our idea of a catchment. It's basically the bowl in which the wetland sits. All right? So here we got the topographic data on the Beck and the Roosevelt. Here's the catchments for those. And we also included a private land catchment. Now, the reason we included this was that this catchment has been farmed underneath conventional tillage practices for more than 50 years. And we know that when we look at these profiles, these soil profiles, using tillage practices typically end up in developing a impermeable layer right below the plow depth. It's commonly called a plow pan or a restrictive layer. So we wanted to include one of these types of scenarios in our modeling efforts because the Beck, I'm going to back up a slide here, in the Roosevelt, these are newly converted grasslands that have been converted into ag practice. I'll explain that in a second. So we included this one. This was right next to the Roosevelt, just a stone throw away. In preparation for these, like I said, these were converted. They were all mixed of grasses and forests that the Fish and Wildlife Service owned. Started turning over to sod. It took quite some time. Here's one of the pictures of them turning over to sod for the first time. This is what it looked like finally when it was almost done. That's our wetland. That's one of our test wetlands right in front, that picture there. Here's another picture of it. Now you see these big green spots in the background here. These were eventually taken out and it's all bare soil. The reason they're green right now at this time of this picture was that there was too many boulders, rocks, car parts, barns, animal bones for them to till up that we had to pluck out of there before they could finish tilling. In the foreground, you'll see a little white canister on the ground. That is one of our gas sampling chambers. We are also using these sites for our greenhouse gas monitoring effort. This conversion of grassland to farmland was a great opportunity for us to look at gas emissions because we got them before it. We took measurements of gas emissions before they converted from the grassland to the cropland, and we're continuing to do so. It's one of the few so far projects that are leveraged on these research sites. There's potential for more to come. Here's kind of an illustration of our equipment layout, our instrumentation for these catchments. Starting at the top of the catchment, where the weather station is. That's our weather station up there at the top of the catchment. We also have, as you come down the slope, you can see our logging rain gauges. We have two of them out there to catch the variation, and there is variation just within the catchment. These are logging rain gauges. We have two of those. Also in the soil, we have soil temperature loggers at two depths, at 15 and 30 centimeters. Working our way down the slope, you'll see these blue vertical lines. These are our soil moisture logger arrays. Each one of the little circles indicate a soil moisture probe. We have them at roughly 10 centimeters, 25, 50, 75, 100, and 130 centimeters. And we have them placed, as you can see, above the tile and below the tile. Now that's for the Beck site, which has tile. The Roosevelt site and the Hesh site do not have tile, but we put them in basically the same distance away from the wetland based on the setback distance. Also in these wetland catchments, we also have wells and piezometers so we can monitor the groundwater. And in the wetland itself, we have automatic water level loggers. Here's a quick picture of one of our colleagues installing the soil moisture loggers. A trench was dug and these were placed in a vertical orientation down below the tile line to a depth below the tile line. And like I said, there's an array above the tile, upslope of the tile, and then there's another array below or downslope of the tile line. Now, what we're getting from these soil moisture loggers, I just want to quickly jump off the track here for a second. This is a graph that we made from the data we obtained from the soil moisture loggers last year. Last year was our first year in collecting data from this. And what you can see here is the wetland ID back 6 position. This is the upper one. This is the one. This is upslope of the tile, and it's not important to see to discern all those lines as far as soil moisture. All right. The question is, as you can see here, is that we got data. Is there a question? Okay. The point I want to make here is that we got data from these soil moisture loggers before the tile was put in. The question is, once we put the tile line in, what is going to happen to the soil moisture, especially downslope of the tile line? We're looking at the effects of soil moisture on, the most common of thoughts is germination conditions for wetland plants, overwintering conditions for amphibians, etc. So that's why we're kind of looking at the soil moisture content. Here's an interesting thing that we picked up on was that we believe this is that Hesh site, that private site that's been tilled for more than 50 years, in that plow pan. Now, if you look kind of close, I know it's kind of hard to see, but if you look at the very bottom line, it's a blue line. That is our surface soil moisture. That's our 0 to 10 centimeter depth. All right. I'm going to flip back one slide here. And looking at the blue line, the very top line in the Beck lower position, the one that has the tile pipe illustrated in it, you can see the soil moisture on that site is up about 40% and then drops off over time. But looking at the Hesh site, you can see the soil moisture for that 0 to 10 centimeters is starting around about 20% and then drops off. But what's interesting is the black line, the very top black line there. You can see, and I believe this is the case of where water is ponding up on that plow pan, and then slowly, either through ET processes or finally through slope permeability soil, is slowly dropping off. So what we're seeing there is, I think, it's the plow pan, which really affects hydrology in these catchments, the movement of water towards the wetland. This is what our catchment looked like last year in soybeans. That white post standing up is one of our wells right at the edge of the wetland. And there's soybeans in the foreground and on that hillside. In order to get to the tile, which we just got installed last November, we had somebody from the ag industry come out and actually build us a tile plan using survey techniques and GIS. And eventually, through a lot of false starts and paperwork, we finally got a tile contractor out here as of November 2013 to put the tile in. And that's a picture of them putting the tile in on our Beck sites. This is a tile plow for those who are not really familiar with them or haven't seen them floating around our part of the world up here. This tile plow is GIS driven for the depth. GPS sounds better. GPS driven. That plow moves up and down into the soil. The tile goes in the top chute. I wish I could show it to you with a mouse, but I can't. Oh, can you? I probably can't see my mouse. But it goes in the top chute and it comes out the bottom, and it's actually dragged into place and held by the soil as the tractor moves forward. Here's a picture of that tile going in on our wetland catchment.
Ray, we can see your cursor if you want to use it.
Okay, great, thank you. Let me back up a quick picture here then. This is where the tile goes in, this is where the tile comes out. Pretty simple. And you can tell from this picture, you can see the tile moving in here, and you can't see it, but this is the trench that's left behind. They did have a difficult time at this time in November. The ground was a little bit frozen. We were hoping to get it in September, but like I said, lots of false starts and lots of contractors that said they could do it. So what you see in front of the tractor, the tile plow, is actually a track hoe pulling the other tractor to get it going. Because if you notice this soil right in here, it's about 6 to 8 inches. That's frozen. The upper half was already frozen at the time when we were doing this install. Here's another picture of the trench after it's done. The tile's down there. They came along with a bulldozer and plowed it back over to smooth it out. And what you see here is also the water control structures we had installed in the tile. They actually stopped putting the tile in place, cut the tile, and they put these boxes in. These boxes are 6 feet tall. They're a stop log structure. and they are along the tile line. They will help us. They can help us actually turn off effectively the tile if we wanted to do that down the road. This practice is being bolstered by the NRCS as part of their drain water management practice to put these stop log structures in. We had the opportunity to put them in. We thought it was a great idea to do it. Like I said, it also affords us, if we wanted to, we could literally turn off the tile, just pretend it's like it's not really there by closing off these water control structures. Here's kind of a fisheye lens view of the tile around our catchment. It's been stretched out, but you can see those yellow marks indicating the tile path going around the wetland, stops about here, and then the other one starts around this side. This is our study site, this wetland right here. Here's a bird's eye view of the tile lines. Here's the tile lines here in these dark red colors going down to our outlet on both sides of the wetland. The kind of a red or pinkish dots are the actual, I think they're control structures, and the blue dots are actual additional survey points that we made. You can also see on this wetland here, both on back sites, we have it on this side of the slope and on this side of the slope, and the outlets are down here in the green zones.
Where are you discharging into?
The discharge from these tile lines on this side, on Beck, go into Fish and Wildlife wetlands. Then on this side, it crosses over into like a drainage way, a little coulee, and eventually flows down across the road off Fish and Wildlife property. Here's kind of an underground look at those tile lines. The installer, the contractor, provided us with GPS points every 3 feet of the tile. And what we did with that was we verified the grade on the tile. According to my calculations, we're in the neighborhood of 99 to 98% downflow for every foot of that tile, or every 3 foot section on that tile. So we're really pleased with the tile installation. There's no spots that are really going to literally not contribute to the tile outlet. And speaking of the tile outlet, this is the tile outlet. This in itself was a steep learning curve for a slow person like myself, but it consists of a flume. I'm going to put my mouse on the flume. This is the flume. This is called a Parshall. This is a 3-inch flume, typically used a lot by the water science centers. The water science folks use these in streams to get flow measurements. We had to modify it a little bit. This section up here, as you can tell, is the approach. This box itself was something we had to make because we just could not buy them in time to get them installed this spring. Same with the Parshall flumes. This is used to, shall we say, calm the water, so it's not coming out very turbulently out of the pipe. You can see here's a mock of the drain pipe coming into it. So it flows down this path, flows down through here, drops out this bottom flume. Our pressure transducer up here, this cigar-shaped instrument, falls inside this box, and there's a little hole that allows the water to rise and drop in this box. Pressure transducer records that as pressure level, water level, sorry, because of the pressure transducer. We log it on to the CR1000 loggers, and that way we can get at the flow. Also, because there is unknowns, I should say, as to how much flow is going to come out of this system, never having done this before, especially in this particular part of the world, we designed an overflow. And that's what this tank is for down here. This is a 55-gallon tank that we put at the end of this pipe. It's downslope of it that we can catch the trickle. We wanted to be able to try to quantify almost every ounce of water coming out of these flumes. Here's a picture of it in the field during the June tile field day we had. This is me. This is my best side here. And here's the flume. And this is that trickle pipe I'm talking about. It's right underneath the flume. It catches the low flow events where we were under we have the idea that the high flow events would shoot off the flume, bypass the pipe, flow down this black plastic pipe and onto the grass on its way out to the next wetland. On low flow events, they trickle down into this pipe. This pipe runs down slope, down to the tank you see here. The pipe drops in the top here, and then we drain it. We're trying to come up with a continuous drain. This is our prototype here. This is a drain pipe here, connected by a stopcock. And inside this box, we have a flow meter. This flow meter tells us basically how much water is coming out of that tank, so we don't have to sit there and empty it every other day. It gives it 200 liters per second or gallons per minute, and we can convert that to how much water is being redirected by the tile. Now here's kind of like a event timeline on the field study. Starting in August of 2012, finalized the study sites, set up design. We got the farmers, the renters, to sign up for the 2 fish and wildlife sites. Got the equipment installed. October, a lot more site preparation. Started collecting data. Sorry. And in May, continued site preparation. Like I said, we had some green spots that need to be come out because of the boulders. The first crop was in 2013, soybeans. And in November, we got our tile lines put in at the back site. This past May, we started planting again. The farmers planted wheat this time. We got our equipment back in. So this is actually our first year, our first growing season where we're getting data with the tile lines in place. I kind of quickly like to go to the spatial component of our project. The idea of this spatial component was to gather characterizations on the tile, information on the tile, its location, distribution, the size of the tile, the diameter of the tile, how deep it was. Try to get to all that, because with that information we can make some estimates of how much water is being moved off the landscape. Kind of hook that up with soils information, the wetlands inventory, and what kind of crops they're using in those areas. We're hoping to make some projections using models on what soil characteristics or what site characteristics seem to be important for tile use. Why are people putting tile in? What are they looking for in their soils, or what's going on in their soils that have to put tile in? And more importantly, where is tile going? Right? And then to model these effects to ecosystem services as well, such as waterfall, habitat, water storage, and carbon sequestration. All right, so in order to get some tile information, we started off with trying to do surveys. We try to do aerial surveys. We try to use satellite imagery to get at tile locations. We actually did road surveys, and we found the most abundant and most so-called, or I guess best data source was tile permits. We concentrated tile permits for North Dakota and South Dakota. North Dakota, we were lucky to have a state water commission database that had subsoil tile permits as one of the attributes, and they provided us with the tile permit locations for North Dakota. South Dakota, no such luck. South Dakota, we actually went to the county seats and looked into county records for tile permits and collected those by hand. Most of those were handwritten tile permits that were collected and then compiled into an electronic format. All right. So, and with that, we built a map on where tile permits are for the Dakotas. And that's what you can see on the other side of the map, the survey methods there. That's the Minnehaha County in South Dakota. The red dots are the permit data. The yellow dots are our aerial surveys that we did with the Fish and Wildlife Service. The blue dots, which you cannot see very many of, are satellite surveys. We didn't find satellite surveys to be very helpful. It was hard to tell where tile was. Lots of times we just weren't sure enough to put it on the map as that's a tile location. So this map was generated from mostly from, well, in this case, all the permits. This map was generated from all the tile location permits that we had. And in North Dakota, as of August 2012, we had more than 700 permits. When I last checked in November 2013, we were over 900 permits. In South Dakota, as of April 2012, we had 4,300 permits. When I did some updates in December of 2013, we were greater than 4,900. Now, this jump between 4,300 and 4,900 is based on two counties in South Dakota, Roberts and Minnehaha. Those are the only two counties that I could call and get tile permits electronically from them. So that contribution of 600 permits over that time span was from two counties in South Dakota. The question comes in mind is how good of an estimator this is tile location. It's not very good at all, but it's one of the best ones I know of. The trouble with tile permits is that they're only required for most cases. It's in North Dakota, this is the rule. In South Dakota, it's by county, but it's only required for if the tile affects more than 80 acres. All right? So there's a high proportion of tile locations, tile install systems that are undocumented. So this is definitely an underestimation of tile permits, but as far as we know, it's a first stab, especially for the Dakotas. This information we collected on the tile locations was put up on Sciencebase earlier this year. This is Sciencebase is a USGS supported Sciencebase catalog. Is its full name at the bottom down there is the address. And on this Sciencebase catalog, you can get to all this data. You can get comma delimited files of all the tile locations that we have, the map, other project presentations, and a quick little overview of the project. And you can just type in tile, or you can go to our project webpage there, Agricultural Subsoil Drainage Tile and Wetlands Project. All right, at this time, I'll kind of hold off on any questions or comments, if that's okay with you guys, and let Brian take over and talk about some of the data we have attained and the modeling efforts. Okay, Brian?
Sounds good.
All right. Let's see. Okay, Rick, this is where I get lost.
Okay, I just changed the presenter to Brian, so Brian, you just click share my desktop and you should be able to pull up your PowerPoint. There we are.
Okay, there it is.
Take it away.
All right. So I'm going to follow up with Ray here and talk a little bit more about our approach to assessing potential impacts to tile to wetland hydrology. Tried not to, or to kind of keep the redundancy between with Ray's talk low here. I'll also provide a little more background on some of the different tiling scenarios we see out there. All right, just a quick overview. I'll talk a little bit about the guidelines and regulations and some of the setbacks, some of the Fish and Wildlife Service information needs that led to this project. Give a brief overview of the wetland water balance. Talk about the potential effects of subsurface drainage or the tile drainage on wetlands. Run through some of the primary tile scenarios that we have identified. Talk about our modeling effort in the field study, and then go with some of the preliminary results and discussion, and then just wrap up a little bit with some of the ongoing and future work. All right, just a quick overview here with the guidelines and regulations. So any of the agricultural producers that are enrolled in the Farm Bill programs, they're required to use the setbacks or the setback distances when installing tile next to wetlands. And this little diagram here kind of shows that, you know, the setback is basically a distance from the edge of the wetland to where your tile is. And it's site-specific, varies by soils and slopes and all those sorts of things. And this is usually provided by the NRCS to the landowners. They use these equations, such as the Van Schiffgard equation. They're basically calculate the soil water drops, you know, based on tile placement and those sorts of things. And really, what they were meant to do is to determine the optimal tile spacing in relatively flat terrain to best manage that soil water profile. So really, they weren't designed to limit impact to wetlands, and it's not really known, how well good a job they do at protecting wetlands or limiting impacts to the hydrology. So that sort of led to the question, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service policy. They had a lot of requests coming in about tiling on, near easement wetlands and those sorts of things. So they needed some information to come up with a good policy that would, prohibit the drainage and impacts to the wetlands. And that's kind of how this project came to be. Here's just a quick overview of the wetland and water balance. The pothole wetlands, the primary water sources are direct precipitation, snowmelt runoff, a big one, and then surface runoff due to precipitation events. You also have the primary loss is evapotranspiration. You have some secondary inputs and losses associated with groundwater connections, such as recharge, discharge, surface water overflow, and those sorts of things. And the main point here is that a large, one of the main factors in the wetland water balance is that surface water runoff. So if you're putting tile up there somewhere in the catchment, you have the potential to impact that surface water runoff, and hence the wetland hydrology and the ecosystem services that are related to that and those sorts of things. So the main point here is if you're putting tile in the wetland catchment, there's potential to impact that hydrology. Okay, I'm going to have a few slides here on the potential effects of the tile drainage on wetland hydrology. The image on the left obviously is, a direct drainage effect. If you run tile and riser pipes right through a wetland, you're essentially just directly draining the water out of there, and, that's kind of a no-brainer there. And then there's a number of scenarios where you can have indirect effects, such as the image on the right, where you're going to have evenly spaced tiles throughout a field. And in these cases, they may tile around the wetland and use setbacks, but they're going to be affecting the soil moisture and the surface runoff and those sorts of things around the wetland. So there's a potential to indirectly affect the wetland by tiling around it. And there's a number of ways you can do this. This is just sort of one example. So I'm kind of going to give you an overview here of the sort of four scenarios that we kind of go with right now, and then I'm going to have a slide on each of them to give you a better depiction of them. So essentially our first potential effect scenario is the disruption of surface runoff from the catchment. And you saw by the slide that Ray showed you there, that's kind of what we're looking at. So if you're in a hummocky terrain, which is characteristic of a lot of the prairie pothole region, if you place a tile upslope with a wetland in the catchment somewhere, you have the potential to disrupt the surface runoff from the catchment. So in the simple sense, that's one scenario. The second scenario is, you can remove water via the kind of subsurface flow or lateral effect of tile. And this is kind of the textbook example, if you can imagine more of a flat landscape, and you have a wetland there, and you're placing tile on it. You get that lateral effect of tile where there's a distance out of the tile that it's going to be drawing water from or affecting the soil moisture from. And that's sort of another scenario, and they vary in this sense by the topography they're located in, a flat versus hummocky terrain. The third scenario is sort of an encirclement, and the sort of definition of that is if you encircle around a groundwater-fed wetland in sort of relatively flat terrain, you're going to be interrupting that groundwater, which could both draw water away from a wetland and, obviously reduce the inputs to a wetland. And then the fourth one is kind of one that's been brought up by field staff in the service, where it's becoming more and more common, is where they tile up to a wetland from sort of below the wetland in a hummocky catchment, so they're technically outside of the catchment, but they can shoot the little tile sort of risers out of there and shoot it up below a wetland, and there's potential to impact the groundwater or get into that soil moisture and draw more water out of a wetland that way as well. So these are kind of our four main scenarios, which I'll have a slide on each following this. And sort of some of the things to consider here is, these kind of vary on the effects. Some of them affect inputs, and some of them are removing water. And they're kind of dependent on the terrain, flat versus hummocky sort of terrain. And there are other things to consider are, the setbacks. you're going to have different impact if you're following the setbacks or if you're tiling close to a wetland and those kind of things. Soils is a big thing. Obviously, the setbacks are based on the soils. But there's also raised system, that plow pan sort of thing, and you get the clay pans underneath wetlands. So some of the sort of basis for some of these equations are based on more upland soils and soil water movement, and they don't really consider some of these restrictions and the low lateral flow you can get in the prairie pothole, glacial till in these clayey wetland soils. So it's kind of that wetland up versus upland as well as the setback characteristics. And then sort of to go with the inputs and removal of the water source, is the tile affecting surface water, that near surface pore water, groundwater, and those sorts of things. So there's a lot of variability here on potential impacts of tile to the wetland hydrology. So here's that sort of a graphic of that first scenario, the one we're looking at with this study, where you have a wetland catchment, the tiles placed upslope in that catchment. So you're going to be interrupting that surface runoff at some point. And as you can see in the graphic here, I kind of have the tile line here, I guess setback from a wetland and a tile line, and there's an affected area up there. So what we're doing is that we're affecting the soil moisture, infiltration, and surface runoff from the area above the tile line. And that can also affect the hydraulic head of the whole slope, which can affect that near surface runoff, which is pretty important to wetland hydrology as well. So yeah, the potential effect here is the soil moisture, the pore storage, infiltration, and then that runoff. And this scenario sort of assumes a recharged wetland, so we're not really considering groundwater. We're just looking at this and saying, okay, if we place tile here above the wetland and the catchment, we're affecting some portion of that catchment and reducing runoff. So what does that mean to important wetland characteristics such as depth, hydro period, and those sorts of things? So here's that lateral effect model that we talk about. Here you can see sort of a wetland basin and flat topography. Here's the tile, and you get this lateral effect, which shows where essentially the tile would be drawing pore water from. And this is typically used, like in the picture in the right here, to space these tiles at an optimal distance to manage the soil moisture in that field. So in terms of wetlands, this sort of scenario, assuming you use the proper setback, that's saying that you'd have minimal impact on the wetland as long as the affected area, just doesn't reach that wetland and that sort of thing. Whereas on the left side, if it's a little closer, you'd have a proper setback. You're saying you could potentially draw water out of there. And this one could use a little more work as well, because that's under the assumption of some of these upland looser soils with the wetland clay pans and stuff that we get in the low vertical water transport rates in these glacial tills. We don't know how much water would actually be removed from a wetland in this sort of scenario anyway. So this is sort of that second scenario. The third scenario, this is more of a top-down view where you have a groundwater-fed wetland, you tile around it. So you're obviously going to be impacting both the water going into a wetland, and you could potentially drop that whole water table of the area. That one's fairly straightforward. And this is that sort of outside the catchment one that I talked about that you're starting to see, where in a hummocky terrain you have a wetland up here. So once you really get over the spill point, you're technically out of the catchment, but they may run some tile rises up from underneath, and that could potentially affect the water here, or the groundwater or surface water. But that effect as yet would be sort of unknown. So those are kind of our four main scenarios. So as I said, we're looking at that first one of the study, the impact of tiling up in the catchment above a wetland. Sort of our assessment approach, use a combination of modeling and field data to assess potential impacts on the water balance of the wetland. As I mentioned, the scenarios, we're looking at the effect of surface water runoff. And we have a water balance model here that I'll get into in a minute that sort of describes the modeling approach. And then the field study, we have the data we're using for model calibration, and we can also use the field data to quantify effects of drainage. As Ray showed, we can measure the tile discharge, reduced runoff, reduced soil moisture, those sorts of things. So you can sort of quantify some of the potential impacts of the tile. Okay, I guess Ray already went over the field sites, so I won't go over that one too much. We got the 4 sites, 2 tiled and 2 are not tiled. Here's just kind of an overview of the wetland model. I'm not going to get into the nuts and bolts too much. It's a fairly simple water balance model. We looked at the primary factor driving this sort of seasonal surface water expression, direct precipitation, runoff, ET, surface outflow, those sorts of things. The important part is that the outputs of the model are sort of ecologically important factors such as depth, surface area, volume, hydro period, those sorts of things that can be related to habitat quality or species requirements and those sorts of things. Essentially, the important thing is what we're doing is we're just modeling what a wetland, the surface water expression of a wetland, how long does it hold wetland or water, how deep is the water, and those sorts of things. Like I say, that you can relate to ecological characteristics. So we took the 4 sites with our initial data from 2013 prior to the tile. We developed the model for each site, did a quick validation and calibration with the field data. We ended up with the 4 sites with a calibrated model for 2013. These graphs just sort of show that calibrated model for each site. The blue lines are simply precipitation. The red lines are the measured field depth from our loggers in the wetlands. And the purple line is the model predicted depth. So this shows we have pretty good concordance. The model performs well on all sites with a few minor calibrations. So we have a model that we can use as a basis to run some scenarios. Before I get into the results, I just wanted to show you a little bit of the nuts and bolts of the model to help with the interpretation. Essentially, in the model, we have 3 separate surface areas. We have the upland or zone or the contributing area, which would be the catchment, and that's a static area. The yellow line would be a static wetland boundary, which is based on the spill point. So then inside the wetland, we have 2 zones which are dynamic, which would be the ponded and non-ponded portion of the wetland zone. So the wetland either gets deeper, shallower through the season. Those areas are dynamic, and the only reason I'm showing you this is because some of the results are just broken down by these zones, just to give you an idea of what we're talking about. Okay, so here's a pie chart based off those calibrated models that I just showed you. So what we have here is the percent of water inputs for the entire year by source, and when I say source, it's those catchment areas. So here, the blue slice of pie is the amount of water in the seasonal water balance of those sites that is attributed to direct precipitation. So the inputs to direct precip. So you can see in all these sites, the majority of the water came from direct precipitation in 2013, ranged, according to the model, and it ranged from about 38% to 62%. The brown slice of the pie is that non-ponded portion of the catchment. It's a smaller piece of the pie, so you can think of the brown and the blue as sort of the wetland itself, the sort of wetland proper, the basin. And then the green part of the catchment is that upland zone or contributing zone. And you can see the proportion of the water inputs or the surface water runoff, essentially, and near surface water runoff ranges from roughly 27% to 53%. So we know by placing tile in the wetland catchment, we have the potential to impact some portion of that green slice of the pie or the surface water runoff to these wetlands. We don't know what proportion necessarily, but we know that there's potential to impact at least a quarter or better of the water inputs of these wetlands. So here's that same image Ray showed you of the tile lines on the 2 tiled sites, and the sort of yellow circles are just a representation of the catchments. So as you can see here, and they're not necessarily correct, they're just a circle on here for demonstration. But so what we know here is there's the portion of the catchment above the tile lines in these 2 catchments were approximately 22% of the catchment and 37% of the catchment for these 2 sites. So there's a good deal of the catchment were above the tile lines in these cases, and we know we can impact some portion of that surface runoff from there. Thing is, like I said, we don't know what proportion. It sort of depends on antecedent conditions, time of year, evaporation from the upland plants, and a whole bunch of factors like that. So we can run a whole bunch of scenarios to test, different levels of impact, if you want to see it that way. Or in this case, we said, okay, for this first run, until we have our tile data for some more validation, let's say 100%. We're just going to say everything above this tile for this first scenario does not contribute to the wetland anymore. We're going to say the tile is impacting 100% of the area above it. We know it's probably something less than that, but that's just what we're going to go with for this initial shot, first worst case scenario. So essentially what we did is we reran the models, and we just essentially cut the catchment off at the tile line. So now our contributing area is defined by the tile instead of the true topographic catchment. So here are the results from that initial model run for the BEC 5 site. The graph on the left is the sort of calibrated 2013 model, no tile, just run regular. Over here on the right side is the simulation model where we cut the catchment off at the tile line. So as you can see, there's a slight effect on depth, on the model depth versus what we saw in the field, but it wasn't great. It was a moderate effect. Then we go to the next slide. This is the exact same thing as the BEC 6 site. You have the calibrated model on the left and the simulated tile on the right. Once again, there's a small effect, but nothing major on the wetland depth. Here's just a graph of those data looking at the volume, so the amount of water in. If you look on the bottom, the 5.2 is the calibrated model, and the 0.3 is the simulated tile model, so 6.2 and 5.2, and then the other 0.3s. So you can see there was a little bit of water volume reduced with the tile, but it was relatively small compared to the overall water budget for 2013. So just kind of the preliminary results here, talk about some of the constraints and interpretation of that initial preliminary model run. The results are obviously contingent on the model parameters and assumptions. If we're assuming that our model's right, then we're pretty confident that it's close. It worked well on all of our sites. It's also contingent on the 2013 starting point and the weather, because weather can have a big effect here, and the site-specific soils and land use. The contributions of those different areas, which we're all pretty confident with. And the results are also dependent on the proper implementation of the setbacks. You can see by some of those pictures that Ray showed and I had in here, the tile setbacks were up. The tile was set back pretty high relative to where the wetland edge was in these catchments. So this sort of suggests that when, in this case, when the tile is placed properly, it can maybe have a small impact on wetland hydrology in given these conditions in 2013. Some of the other factors that are expected to affect the sort of impact of tile can be catchment size and slopes. You can have steeper, longer slopes, land use, vegetation, all these sorts of things would vary from site to site. And we also expect the effect of tile, to vary from year to year or owing to the weather fluctuations, runoffs dependent on antecedent soil conditions and, the intensity and amount of precip and those sorts of things. ET, surface runoff, the spring surface area if you had a high snowpack winter versus low one, those sorts of things. So you're going to have a lot of interannual variation in the potential impacts of tile as well. And obviously the tile would be expected to have a greater effect during wetter years where there's more potential to generate surface runoff and those sorts of things. So some of the future work is to continue doing some of the scenario modeling for the non-drain sites based on theoretical setbacks, as well as more scenario modeling on our tiled sites. We'll be able to implement our 2014 data, which include the tile discharge, and hopefully beyond. Hopefully we'll be able to continue this monitoring to capture a number of weather years. And then, like I said, we'll be able to supplement our models with measured tile discharge. We can compare model changes in model volume with the tile discharge and estimate the surface runoff and those sorts of things. So going forward, we have we'll have a lot more information after, since we have the tile in now and we're collecting those data. And in the end, you know, you can show the potential changes to wetland hydrology, GG, and those sorts of things. But then, you know, the real question is, what are the ecological effects? So, like I say, we can model potential effects to hydro period and depth and those sorts of things to identify, you know, the meaningful changes, you know, both at a site and landscape scale. You know, look at habitat requirements for waterfowl, shorebirds, other wetland-dependent birds as an example. And, you know, can use, you know, build on and partner with some of the, you know, service and other folks that have worked on habitat models that are based off, you know, measures of wetland hydrology, such as, you know, surface area and depth and change and those sorts of things, and kind of incorporate into those sorts of model, you know, potential impact of tile under, you know, countless scenarios and those sorts of things. So you can, you know, kind of get to the what if of the question versus just, you know, what it's doing to wetland hydrology. We can look into more of the ecological aspect, which is the real question here. So I tried to run through there quick to get through in the hour, and looks like I did it. So I guess at this time, if there's any time left, I guess Ray and I can field any questions you may have here.